Good morning. I want to continue today with my presentation that I've called It Was the Best of Times, It Was the Worst of Times, 2020 through 2044. And this will be part two of that presentation. In part one, I went back and talked about the astrology behind major events that happened in the years 2020, 2021, and 2022. And in part two, I'm going to start with the uh, the war between Israel and Hamas that began on October 7th, 2023, and then we'll move on to the April 8, 2024 solar eclipse. I'll talk about some of the people and countries that have been wounded by that eclipse, where we had an exact triple conjunction of Sun, Moon, and Chiron. And later in part three, which I'll probably record tomorrow, I'll continue talking about how that solar eclipse has impacted various people and countries. And finally, in part four of this series, I'll begin with the upcoming US presidential election. And then we'll look at the astrological weather and possible events that might occur between fall 2024 and the year 2044. Okay, so let's get started. Let's see if I can share my screen here. Get back to my slideshow. And I have to hide some panels so that I can see what I'm doing. So just give me a second here. Okay, so hope you can see this. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. Uh, 2020 through 2024, 2044. And let me just scroll down to part two. And here we are, part two. Okay. On October 7th, 2023, Hamas attacked Israel. This is a chart set up for the transits at the time of that attack, the time it was in Tel Aviv. And no astrologer is going to be surprised by what they see here. Pluto was making a very strong square to Mars and the lunar nodal axis. And then the moon, in opposition to Pluto, was acting as a trigger point to set things off. So Pluto can represent death and destruction, Mars, anger and aggression. The lunar nodal axis intensifies everything. So astrologically, it's not surprising that something of that nature happened at this time on October 7th, 2023. But the big question is, why Israel? Why did things happen in Israel and not somewhere else? Well, to understand that, we have to look at another element of this chart. And in particular, notice this opposition between the Sun and Chiron. Okay, it's pretty strong. If we now take a look at Israel's chart, you also see an opposition between Sun and Chiron in that chart. So this set up a resonance between Israel and the transits on that day, October 7th of 2023. Now, let me explain this Sun-Chiron opposition in a little bit more detail. You can think of the Sun as representing, it can represent either leaders, prominent people in a nation, or the soul of the nation. As for Chiron, many people associate this small planetoid with wounding, but if you think of planets as representing psychological drives within us, it really makes no sense for us to have a drive to wound ourselves. So, what is Chiron really about? Well, it orbits between Saturn and Uranus. Sometimes it dips inside of the orbit of Saturn and sometimes outside of the orbit of Uranus. And as such, it represents a bridge between the visible planets, Sun through Saturn, and the invisible planets, Uranus through Pluto. In other words, Chiron is a drive within us to go beyond the visible world, to go beyond those things we can see, and to venture into the spiritual world, the invisible realm, realms where we sense everything, we feel everything, and feel connected to everything. So, whenever we hear a voice inside of us, looking around at the world and saying, surely there must be something more than this, more than what I see, that is the voice of Chiron urging you to transcend. Now, at its best, Chiron is this very joyous, transcendent energy, which can help us feel connected with everything and help us receive knowledge about those things not seen. However, not everyone is ready for that kind of transcendent experience. At its best, it's an experience of joy and light and transcendence. But not everyone's ready for that, and that's where the wounding comes in. Some people have very hard Saturnian shells that have to first be cracked before the light can enter. And that's why I often say you can't make a cosmic omelet without cracking a few cosmic eggs. Now, in the case of Israel, in an opposition, I should also point out that the goal of an opposition is to integrate the two opposites with one another. So, this side of the opposition can initially start out as being something different, but you want to make it a part of this side. You want to bring the two halves together to make a whole. And when an opposition between Sun and Chiron is successfully integrated, then it fills the person or the country with light. And in Israel's case, they would then fulfill their ancient mission to be a light unto the nations. And that happens a lot when it comes to Israeli science and academics and even the arts. But for any nation, it's rather rare for it to express the higher aspects of Chiron consistently. So instead, what is more likely politically is that Israel will be wounded, and then Israel will wound others in return. And the cycle just keeps going back and forth, back and forth. And that is what happened on October 7th when Israel received a terrible wound, and then it went on to wound others in response. Okay, now here I have a bi-wheel with the transits for that October 7th attack on the outside and Israel's chart on the inside. And notice that transiting Uranus is strongly conjunct to Israel's sun and in opposition to Israel's natal Chiron. Uh, the sun is the soul of the nation. Uranus can represent unexpected events. Chiron can represent wounding. And there was this sudden uh, wounding that occurred to the country. The sun is in the eighth house, which can represent death and transformation, among other things. So, this Sun Chiron opposition was being activated on October 7th, 2023, for Israel. And to me, all of this explains why the very tense transits on that day that we had Pluto square Mars and the lunar nodal axis and an opposition to the moon. That's a lot of tension, a lot of potential for violence and destruction. But This explains to me why it happened to Israel in the Middle East and not somewhere else. Now, as a further example of Sun in opposition to Chiron, I want to take a look at the chart of Pope Francis. He was born with the Sun Chiron opposition, and this opposition was conjunct the lunar nodal axis, so that only intensifies it. Now, not everyone realizes that as a young man, Pope Francis worked as a chemist. But when he was 21 years old, Saturn, transiting Saturn, was over here near his sun. It began activating the Sun Chiron opposition, first coming into uh, opposition to Chiron, and then moving on into conjunction with the Sun. And when this happened, he had a very severe life-threatening case of pneumonia. It was so severe that he lost almost an entire lung. Almost an entire lung had to be removed. So he was severely wounded by that illness. But afterwards, he became a Jesuit, and then 10 years later, he was ordained as a priest. So this is a classic example of the wounded healer who becomes a shaman. Stimulation of this opposition as a young man resulted first in some wounding, but it later transformed him, and the light entered into his heart, into his soul, his very being. Now, I'm not a Catholic, and I don't agree with all of the positions of the Catholic Church. I don't agree with all of the positions of Pope Francis on a variety of political and religious topics. But whether I agree with him or not, when I look at him, I see a man whose heart is filled with love and compassion for others. That is the higher aspect of Chiron. That's what happened when Chiron gets fully integrated into your heart and soul. So, again, Pope Francis is this classic example of the wounded healer who goes on to become the shaman, the one who can bring light to others. Okay, now let's take a look again at the solar eclipse that happened on April 8th of 2024. Sun, Moon, and Chiron, they were all exactly conjunct at 19 degrees 24 minutes of Aries. This makes things very powerful, and this suggests that the whole year is going to be colored by the nature of Chiron. Uh, at its worst, that can make this a year of wounding. And that is actually probably the most likely outcome of this. And so far this spring, we have seen a tremendous amount of wounding in the world. But some individuals will respond to the higher nature of Chiron, and they are the ones who will experience uh, healing and joy as a result, as a consequence of this conjunction. So some people are going to be healed this year, others will transcend and experience a beautiful spiritual joy. But for the majority of the world, it's probably going to be an awful lot of wounding. And unfortunately, that's been the case so far. Now, also happening at the time of this eclipse, there was a pretty strong conjunction between Mars and Saturn. This conjunction became exact 2 days later, and there are good and bad ways this could work out. On the one hand, we have two malefics coming together, so we sort of expect this to get really bad. At its worst, Mars is aggression, anger. Saturn is a lot of restriction and frustration. And when anger is frustrated, you reach a point where it just explodes. So that is would be the negative consequence of this conjunction. On the other hand, Since Saturn represents regulation and restriction, a more positive outcome would be for Saturn to urge restraint when it comes to anger and aggression. And that also happened uh, with regard to Israel and Iran. They were very much in danger of out and out war between the two countries. That almost happened, but fortunately, each country decided to make some symbolic gestures and pulled back from the brink of war. And hopefully that will continue. Nonetheless, we've seen a lot of increases in war and violence in parts of the world following this eclipse. Now, the other thing that was pretty strong at the time of this eclipse was this conjunction between Jupiter and Uranus, which became exact on April 20th in most time zones. And what's that about? Well, Uranus, it has two aspects here. One, creativity, technological advancements. The other aspect is revolution and rebellion. And Jupiter expands both of those. So, in terms of revolutionary advances in science, this aids the impact of Pluto and Aquarius over here, which is going to bring about all sorts of technological revolutions over the next 20 years. But Jupiter conjunct Uranus has also expressed itself in terms of protests. And since this conjunction, we have seen, at least in America, a lot of pro Palestinian demonstrations and protests by students on college campuses across the nation. And this also is reflected by Pluto being now in Aquarius, where power is transferred from individuals to the people. So you get power transferred to the people. Jupiter conjunct Uranus stirs up issues that people want to revolt about, protest about. And the result is exactly the sort of thing that we saw happening on college campuses this spring. Okay, now uh, I'll spend the rest of this presentation looking at some countries and people that were directly impacted by the solar eclipse, and I'll start with America. Now, when it comes to America, I tend to usually use the July 2nd, 1776 chart for the passage of the Resolution of Independence by the Continental Congress. The Declaration of Independence was approved on that day. July 4th is the day that was printed up and distributed to the people. And I think both July 2nd and July 4th charts, like the Sibley chart for America, that they're both valid. This is because the creation of America was not a single event that happened at a single point in time. It was a process. We had to pass a resolution for independence. We had to print that up and distributed it. Later on, we had to draft a constitution, and then we had to get the constitution ratified. So there are all these different points in time that went into the creation of America, and the charts for those points in time, all of them can be useful for understanding America's future. But anyway, most of what I have to say about transits to the July 2nd, 1776 chart will also apply to the July 4th, 1776 chart, unless I'm talking about aspects to the natal moon, because in a couple of days, this moon will have moved from Capricorn into Aquarius. Well, with that having been said, the eclipse planets are all pretty strongly conjunct natal Chiron, and the transiting lunar nodal axis is conjunct natal Saturn. So, this can result in a fair amount of wounding for America and also causing us to have to revisit our past karma, the results of our past actions represented by Saturn. So there can be restrictions, frustrations also at this time. Okay, now none of this is new. None of this is really new to us because from 1972 to 1975, transit in Chiron made a series of oppositions to natal Saturn and a series of conjunctions to natal Chiron in all of the July 1776 charts for America. These aspects triggered wounding, healing, and transcendence. And the major story during this period was the Watergate scandal and the work of the Senate Select Committee to investigate President Nixon. And that scandal was one of Congress's finer moments. In that work, we saw the higher aspects of Chiron manifesting themselves. Also, the environmental movement and Roe v. Wade were in the news. The environmental movement was gaining a lot of steam at this time, and the Supreme Court, in deciding Roe v. Wade, they gave women the right to have control over their own bodies. What a concept. Well, we're repeating those aspects today. We're now experiencing both astrologically and in terms of events over the years from 2022 to 2025, things that are similar to what we saw in the 70s. So far during this period, we've seen the transcendent work of the January 6th committee. It also rose to the occasion, and ongoing investigations and indictments of Donald Trump. Uh, those are related to the January 6th, 2021 insurrection and to other things Trump has done. Also, climate change and Roe v. Wade are in the news. This time, the Supreme Court took away from women the right to have control over their own bodies. So, if history doesn't repeat itself exactly when astrology repeats, at least it often rhymes. Now, up here you can see when we had a series of 3 oppositions of transiting Chiron to natal Saturn, followed by 3 exact conjunctions of transiting Chiron to natal Chiron. Also, in the summer of 2023, we did not have an exact conjunction of transiting Chiron with natal Chiron, but it got very close and stayed there throughout most of the summer. And it was during this period that we saw, I believe, a couple of indictments of Donald Trump. The wounding that Chiron often causes is political and possibly also environmental. We have seen an awful lot of environmental disasters, for instance, around the country this spring. Okay, let's move on. And now we're going to take a look at Israel. On April 8th, 2024, Uranus was once again activating the Sun Chiron opposition in Israel's chart. And so I pretty much expected things to heat up once again in its war against Hamas. Also, the eclipse points, they're in opposition to this Jupiter Pluto midpoint, and then they're squaring 4 other midpoints pretty strongly in Israel's chart. So, what we have seen is Israel has done more wounding to Hamas, but because Hamas is so embedded, so densely embedded in the civilian population of Gaza, that causes a lot of wounding to Gaza's citizens also. And as Israel wounds Hamas and the citizens of Gaza, we see them getting wounded in the court of world opinion. A lot of people protesting Israel's actions. So uh, it has unfortunately been turning itself into a pariah nation among many, and that is, I personally find that very sad that this is all happening. Now, this is interesting. Even though Saturn has moved on and Pluto has moved into Aquarius, The positions of most of the outer planets are approximately the same as they were during the eclipses of October 2023. Thus, the spring of 2024 may see either a continuation of events from October 2023 or new events that are along the same lines. Okay, during this period from October 2023 to spring 2024, Saturn has moved on about 15 degrees, about half a sign, but all the other outer planets are in pretty much the same position during the spring eclipse season as they were during the fall 2023 eclipse season. The only big difference here is that Pluto has changed signs from Capricorn to Aquarius, indicating that shift in power from individuals to the people. But with so many of these outer planets in the same position, and what I have here is the October 14th, 2023 solar eclipse, October 28th, 2023 lunar eclipse, followed by a March 25th, 2024 lunar eclipse, and then the April 8th, 2024 solar eclipse. In all of these charts, you can see the outer planets, with the exception of Saturn that I don't show there, in pretty much the same position once again. They've all moved forward retrograde to get back to the same position roughly, with the only big difference being that Pluto has moved into Aquarius. So individuals, groups, groups and people now have more power than they did last October. But with these planetary configurations repeating themselves, I was certainly expecting last October to see uh, the same events or new events along the same lines occurring in the Middle East this spring. And that has unfortunately been the case. War has gotten very hot again, ceasefires are not being achieved, and people are suffering. Okay, now if we look at Netanyahu's chart, he is being personally wounded quite a bit. These eclipse planets are in direct opposition to his natal moon at 19 degrees Libra, and they're also activating a couple of midpoints in his chart. Additionally, he has the transiting lunar nodal axis conjunct both Neptune and his natal lunar nodal axis, and he has transiting Saturn in opposition to natal Saturn. So he is certainly being wounded politically at this time, both within Israel and without. There are a lot of protests in the country, a lot of protests and legal actions against him outside of the country. And with transiting Saturn in opposition to natal Saturn, he is reaping what he has sown. He is getting some of the uh, returns of his karma. So it's a very frustrating time for him with a lot of restrictions and perhaps some fantasies, delusions, or misinformation being intensified. Okay. Hamas is also strongly affected by this lunar eclipse because the eclipse points are all strongly conjunct Jupiter at 19 degrees Aries. So, forgive the pun, his luck, his good, Hamas's luck and good fortune are being eclipsed at this point in time. Additionally, transiting Neptune is conjunct the natal lunar nodal axis and making a square to natal Chiron. And this suggests to me that there's a greater likelihood of Hamas's passion and fanaticism being intensified and inflamed at this point in time. But the result is most likely going to be simply more wounding to Hamas. Okay, I think the last chart we're going to take a look at is that of Iran. And there's a bunch of stuff going on in this chart at the time of the solar eclipse. transiting Sun, Moon, and Chiron were directly opposite Pluto at 19 degrees Libra. Mars is in opposition to natal Saturn. Transiting Pluto is in opposition to natal Jupiter, transforming Iran's luck. Transiting Jupiter and Uranus in the first house are in opposition to natal Uranus in the seventh and square the natal Sun. And then there are also some midpoint combinations being activated by the solar eclipse. Those eclipse points are in opposition to the Venus Jupiter midpoint, and they're squaring the Mars Neptune midpoint. So, what do I expect from all of this? Well, I expect wounding to Iran. Uh, let's see, I expect a lot of anger and frustration surrounding Iran. I expect, either oppression from leaders or from others affecting the homeland or the people. And of course, possibly a death of a leader. That is within the realm of possibility here with Pluto going through the 10th house. And with Uranus in opposition to natal Uranus, I expect sudden events to occur, events that affect the soul of the nation or its leaders, the sun. And a video I made on the lunar month from about the first week in May through the first week in June, I noted that transiting Chiron by that time would be squaring Iran's midheaven. And I made mention that there might be some sort of wounding for the leaders of Iran. Now, I can't look at a chart and know exactly what kind of wounding that will be, what form it will take on, but it I did mention that there was a heightened chance or possibility that there would be some wounding to Iran's leaders during this lunar month. Uh, I can't foresee things like the helicopter crash, uh, which killed the Iranian president, but I could see this heightened risk of wounding to leadership, and that indeed happened. So there's a lot of tensions in Iran right now, and I suspect they're both internal and external stresses on the country. Iran is not the most open of societies, so I'm not sure we know everything that goes on there, but this is certainly an intense time for that country. Okay, I believe that's going to be the last slide in part two. So next time I'll take up with part three. And so give me a second here, and I will get back to where I started. Do an end to the slideshow. So I'll stop sharing, and I'm back. Okay, so in this slideshow, we reviewed astrologically uh, things that led to the war between Israel and Hamas. And we began looking again at the April 8th, 2024 solar eclipse, which could have brought healing and joy to the planet. I'm sure it is bringing that to certain individuals here and there. But unfortunately, instead of experiencing a year of healing and joy, we seem to be experiencing a year of wounding, and we're seeing a lot of wounding from things in the Middle East. America is going through its own wounding, both politically and environmentally. We're still going through consequences of the January 6th insurrection and the actions of Donald Trump related to that and other things. And we have experienced many, many environmental storms and disasters in America this year. And when we take a look at part three, which I'll probably record tomorrow, we'll continue talking about some of the people and countries that have been impacted by this recent solar eclipse. And then in part four, I'll start with the US presidential election that will take place in November. And we'll look beyond that to see what happens over the next 20 years from 2024 to roughly 2044. So I hope you join me for those. In the meantime, I'll just say so long and be well, and I hope you join me again. So long.